So we are both from Digital Allies, which is a new grassroots accessibility organization paving the way toward a more inclusive web. And one of our goals is to expand education on some common accessibility gaps that still exist out there, like even in standards, which brings us to this and to AxCon, My Trigger, My Choice, UX for Trigger and Content Warnings. So like I said, I'm Tori Clark. My pronouns are she and them, and I am a white woman with short blonde hair and black glasses. And I'm sporting the new AxCon shirt, which I was given, and I was super psyched to figure out it was purple when I got it and opened it up. The color purple makes me think about accessibility ever since I participated in a study where a colorblind participant claimed that purple was a conspiracy, which I found hilarious. I currently am an accessibility strategist at Airbnb, and I've been doing accessibility for about a decade, focusing on low vision, cognitive, and motor disabilities.
Hi, I'm Kelly Sierra Bradley. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a white passing woman with long brown blonde ombre hair, brown eyes, and glasses. I'm wearing this lovely AxCon shirt as well, and I am super pumped to be here today for my first ever AxCon talk. So thank you very much for having me. I consider myself a jote, a jack of all trades, and music, crafting, game boards. But while I'm a noob on the digital side, my experience with accessibility as an event planner in physical spaces has given me a unique perspective on some of the topics that we're going to be discussing today.
Cool. So why are we here? In general, we just don't want people to trip and fall. Figuratively, anyway. We view trigger warnings a bit like wet floor signs. Everyone benefits from them, but some people are more likely to fall than others. If you think about it, someone who is prone to falling may decide that they need to find another path, or they might need to be more careful as they go across the wet floor. And that's very much how trigger warnings and content notes kind of are. And many in-person spaces had already figured out techniques for helping people with triggers, but when the pandemic shifted activities and events online, many of these warnings didn't follow. At the end of the day, exposure to triggering and/or disturbing content, regardless of intent, is an access issue. So the agenda today is we're going to start with the landscape. So just very basically, what are triggers? What's the trigger warning versus a content note? What are the types of conditions where we have to think about triggers? Then we're going to move on to where we stand. What is currently being done today in the physical, hybrid, or digital spaces? Then we'll move on to obstacles and just briefly cover some of the challenges that stand in the way of doing this effectively. And then, because that's a lot to take in, under how we change, we're going to give everyone a playbook on what they can do to do better in the future. And then we'll finally end with further down the road, where we're just going to talk about what we can do in the future as things progress. So just to start, also an example of what we're going to be talking about today, there is a content note. We will be discussing topics that can cause triggers. There will be no graphic images or descriptions at any point in the presentation, though, so we hope that we've created a presentation that is not bothersome for anyone.
Before we get into the meat of it, let's take a step back and look at our current landscape. I'm sure some of you are already familiar with trigger warnings and content notes in everyday browsing, but we would like to break it down a little bit more. So what are triggers? In simple terms, the APA defines a trigger as a stimulus that elicits a reaction. On a more complex note, the Farlex Partner Medical Dictionary says that a trigger is a system where a minor event causes a major physical reaction, but the two events are generally unrelated in nature. As we discovered, there are many other definitions depending on the context. So for the purpose of this talk, we feel that these two definitions are the most relevant. Digging just a little deeper, these are the characteristics of triggers that we must always consider. The first is mind and body. So triggers can be physical, mental, or even emotional in nature, and sometimes they can even be a combination of those three different factors. So that also means that they are systemic. They can affect the entire body. It might start with one part of your body and then travel to another part or affect different parts of the body at the same exact time. So it's really unpredictable. Physical triggers can cause emotional reactions and vice versa. They are also individual, which means they're unique to each person. So they affect us all in different ways. And they are definitely variable. Triggers range in intensity, frequency, and duration. And while others continue to affect individuals for long periods of time, some can be instantaneous. And in certain circumstances, some can lead to hospitalization. So it is extremely important to remember that the potential severity of triggers is difficult sometimes when designing inclusively. So you can see how each characteristic flows into the next one. It's basically a whole full body experience. So to begin with, we're going to start talking about the different types of triggers. There's 4 main types of mental health triggers. There's external, internal, trauma, and symptom. External means it's impersonal in nature and that they stem from an outside source that shares sensitive content, such as news articles or movies. I've actually experienced something like this before where I avoid a lot of news because I get triggered by I have external triggers myself. Internal is from personal experience or relationships, such as family or workplace culture. The trauma can cause a person to relive a traumatic event over and over, which means they could see the location or the person that was involved in their original trauma, or even hear or see specific words that were used. And then the symptom triggers, it means that a certain physical action, such as losing sleep, an injury, or even not taking prescribed medication, can prompt a trigger. And I've experienced something where I've lost sleep and I've been on the wrong medication, and it actually does affect me in the sense that I can have anxiety attacks, and it is very difficult to go through that. So it's important that we remember these different pieces. And some of the different conditions that are affected by mental health triggers are dissociative disorders, such as dissociative amnesia or dissociative identity disorder, cluster B personalities, including borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder, psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, mood disorders such as depression or bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders, so OCD or phobias, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Please keep in mind that these are just a few examples. There are many more that are not listed here. And just to give you an idea of what an experience is like, I have a quote from J.D. Mays from How Trauma Can Still Shatter Me on the Mighty. My heart pounds, my body shakes, and my reality feels stretched out between then and now, while the now rapidly starts to disappear. I could feel the storm swelling within, and my insides turned into a tornado.
Forgot to unmute myself. So now I'm going to talk about neurodivergent and neurological triggers. And I will start by saying that I know there is a great deal of overlap in these two, but in order to talk about specific topics in both, I've decided to kind of separate them just for discussion purposes. So I'm going to start with neurodivergent triggers, and this is really focused around sensory overload. It was first explored academically back in the 1950s, although this phenomenon has been perceived and tracked much, much longer. And the way it was kind of described and it was being investigated in the 1950s and 60s is as a neurological traffic jam, where there's just so much sensory input that for people experiencing the sensory overload, everything else just shuts down. And what type of inputs cause the sensory overload can range from light, sounds, patterns, textures, climate, whether that's humidity or temperature related or a combination of both. And some of the related conditions where this sensory overload can happen often is autism and ADHD. It also includes stuff like generalized anxiety disorder and PTSD, which technically, yes, is mental health related. But one thing that's really important to understand is that when you have traumatic experiences, it literally rewires your brain. This has been studied extensively. It can even include conditions that affect the nerves and how the sensory inputs are processed, like fibromyalgia and multiple sclerosis. So there's a great article on the Mighty called 21 People Describe What Sensory Overload Looks Like. And here's a quote from Meredith Lime. Everything is coming at me at once, but it seems I'm the only one noticing. I can hear my heartbeat. I can feel the heat of the lamps. I can't function. I'm frozen, stuck. So now I'm going to talk about neurological triggers, which is really focused on the brain and the nerves and conditions related to that. So there's some theories as to the internal causes of this, including excitable brain cells, specifically epilepsy, as well as nerve damage. Also, external triggers are very, very similar to sensory overload, where all the things I talked about before, like light, sound, all of this can be triggers for these conditions as well. So some of these conditions include epilepsy, like I already mentioned, and other seizure disorders, migraines and neuralgia, autoimmune disorders, as well as vestibular disorders, although the latter has a lot more to do with inner ear mechanisms. Here's another article from The Mighty. And this one's very close to me as someone who has pretty bad migraines from time to time. It's by Nicola Lee. If you do not have severe migraines, then you will not know why I do my best to not meet up with any triggers. Migraines are events. They cause my whole body to shut down in different ways. Once again, going back to that systemic piece.
So we've talked a lot about what triggers are and the various types, but in relation to our work, how do we know the appropriate time to use a content note or a trigger warning? So content notes are flags about sensitive topics that a user may find difficult or disturbing to engage with. And trigger warnings are specific statements identifying common triggers like flashing lights or discussion of traumatic materials. It's usually best to use trigger warnings for any explicit graphic visuals or detailed descriptions because content notes are mostly used for media that only mention sensitive content in a broader sense. So what does this mean for us now in present day? How are we already addressing trigger warnings in spaces? As Tori and I explored how trigger warnings work in virtual versus physical spaces, what we were actually talking about were separate zones where people can encounter trigger warnings. We boiled them down into the time, the place, and then the space as a whole. The time refers to an instant warning, something that happens in the moment, such as our content note at the beginning of this talk. The place is in relation to the area of entry where things are going to take place, like signage, or even human or AI guides that give a bit more notice ahead of time. And the space as a whole are systems and processes in place that provide a high level understanding of activities that could be triggering. Sometimes this would include liability forms or other ways to ensure people receive adequate knowledge of potential triggers way in advance. A few examples of trigger warnings in physical spaces. And some of these are probably things you'll be familiar with. Amusement parks, they often have many warnings, such as this one, which is a picture of a behemoth ride. It's a safety guide for right before you get on the ride. And it's got a bunch of different notes on it saying it may not accommodate guests of certain size. There are different heart trouble, high blood pressure, different warnings that tell you maybe to be careful not to go on this ride, or just be aware that these things will be happening on the ride. And in addition to just these signs outside of rides, you will have sometimes videos at the beginning or right before you get on the ride, which is more of a time, like the time kind of trigger, whereas the behemoth sign would be a place, which is because it's right outside the area. And then things like notifications on their website for the amusement park would be something that would be the space as a whole. Another example would be escape rooms. So there's a lot of signage that they put in the space, this would be a place signage. It's a yellow warning sign that says, this escape room uses dramatic special effects, including fog, lighting, sound effects, and jump scares known to cause fright. So those will have liability forms as well. And conferences, there's a picture of a trigger warning A-frame sign on the floor that's basically warning them about the content of whatever session the person is going to go into. And that's another example of the place, whereas it's right outside the area. And the last example is a picture of paperwork. So lots of places will have you sign liability waivers, or you'll find information on a website or other digital spaces as well, which will lead us into our next topic, which is hybrid spaces.
Awesome. So I'm going to talk a little bit about hybrid spaces, specifically academia. For many of you, you may have first heard about trigger warnings when it became a hot button issue in academia back in like the early 2010s. And it led to a lot of controversy because students were asking for trigger warnings on syllabi and course materials. Many worried that it reduces academic freedom, but just as many believe informed decisions are key to learning. And I'd say that students leaned one way and professors another. And while there was kind of a split, really it was a little bit equal between both sides. And there's a really interesting report that this was a part of that was put out by the National Coalition Against Censorship. And the overlap was really fascinating because everybody was worried about academic freedom, but just as many people felt that trigger warnings could actually be helpful for students. At the end of the day, trigger warnings help students engage on their own terms. While some colleges allow people to opt out of certain discussions or assignments as part of this trigger warning, in most cases, students aren't actually excused from any of the material or assignments. They are merely given the time and space to explore it on their own terms. And then that's going to take us to trigger warnings in digital spaces and kind of the state of the state on digital platforms right now. So I have several examples on here. So the first image I have on the left is a blurred overlay on an Instagram image. And it says, there's like a little eye with a cross on it. I'm not quite sure what that's supposed to be saying. And then it says sensitive content. This photo contains sensitive content, which some people may find offensive or disturbing. And then there is an explicit button that says see photo. And so I've seen this blurred overlay also on Facebook videos on my feed when certain things would come up in my newsfeed. There's also on Twitter settings to hide sensitive content or even to mute certain words or phrases, because Twitter is doing a lot to try and improve how people communicate with one another and what people get exposed to on Twitter. And there's something new, which I actually just came across last week, which was cool because then I got to add it to this. But basically, I was going through Twitter and there was a little news blurb about the war on Ukraine. And when I pressed on it, the generic blurb opened up this modal dialogue, which is depicted on this slide. And it says, the following may contain sensitive material. And then there's a nice chunky button that says continue and a nice chunky button that says go back. And this is just a really wonderful example of user consent. And in thinking about all of this, there really is, in my opinion, a happy medium between censorship and warnings, and that happy medium is user choice.
While these current practices are helpful, there are still many gaps within all of the zones. In 2020, the pandemic hit us, and we had a lot of obstacles. One of the biggest hurdles has been the fact that people weren't ready, and they still aren't in a lot of ways. So amid the crisis, large companies were rushed and small companies fell behind. The small businesses pretty much lacked the budget and or the resources to effectively stay inclusive in a virtual space. And some probably couldn't even move to virtual platforms. On the other hand, larger companies were able to continue business in digital spaces, but were remiss in addressing accessibility needs while helping develop these online platforms. So basically, in-person services didn't translate easily from physical to virtual in all the zones. Certain things like signage and guidance are way less effective in a virtual setting, leaving individuals with less time to process potential triggers.
And really, it goes back to the end of like what Kelly was saying. The technology really wasn't ready, even though hybrid and virtual conferences weren't necessarily new. I feel like a lot of companies were used to falling back on the in-person services they were offering as their version of accommodation, saying, well, if you come in, then we can accommodate you. And they weren't really thinking about accommodations on the digital side. And you know, most of the common video streaming tools out there didn't have features like blurs for sensitive content. The most that people could do was remove autoplay. And just in general, the fact that the service is like an A-frame outside of a session room, like the rooms were fundamentally different. And there just wasn't the user experience and the inclusive design in place for people to figure this out. It was ill-defined. I very much liken it to build the bridge when we get there. But despite all of that, for many people, the pandemic actually offered them an opportunity to attend stuff that they never could have attended in the first place. I actually have some friends who are so profound in their sensory defensiveness that they literally cannot go to a conference, even with all the accommodations in the world. It is just completely out of the picture for them. And more reach equals more need. So while it was really great, and it was the first opportunity for many people with sensitivities to attend these spaces and these activities, at the same time, because these people were being excluded from the in-person events, when it translated to digital, people still weren't ready. There were new access needs that they weren't really thinking about yet, and they had to navigate it in a new space. Overall, it was a failure all around when it probably could have been an opportunity all around.
So how do we change? What can we do to overcome these obstacles? We know we just gave you a lot of information to digest. So we came up with a playbook to help guide you when making decisions regarding triggers. So the first is reduce the severity of triggers or avoid triggers altogether. Create reasonable barriers to prevent unintentional triggers. Warn early and often, as well as across multiple zones. Make sure all the warnings are fully accessible or provide alternatives. Provide mechanisms to control or decrease sensory load.
So I'll start with reduce or avoid triggers, and I will actually get to share kind of how this entire talk was created, which was around, me observing some gaps in attending last year's AXCon. And these gaps did not live in the time zone. Every talk I attended that had triggers had perfect trigger warnings within the session. This included Val Head's talk, which focused on animations and flashing lights and a couple of other things. And it also included Eric Bailey's Be the Villain talk. So reduce or avoid triggers. What does that mean? When should you avoid? When should you reduce? So unless it's essential to the activity or the event, you should just avoid it altogether. There's not a need for it. And generally speaking, we want to be welcoming. We want to include people. Now, that being said, as I mentioned, there were two talks at last year's AXCon. One was Val Head, and it was really important to her that she demonstrate and demo what she meant by flashing or flickering content. Now, that being said, she still reduced the potential trigger by removing and respecting the 3 flashes threshold for people with photosensitive epilepsy. But she still understood that it could trigger migraines and warned in the moment before that specific part of the presentation. And then we have Eric Bailey's presentation, Be the Villain, and there's 2 screenshots from that particular talk on this slide. And the first one is a very explicit warning, nice big lettering on the 8 topics that were the nature of the talk's content and what to look out for. And on the one hand, you could say, oh, did he need to include all of that? Well, the whole point of the talk was about subversive design, and it was a really important aspect of the talk to prove his point. That being said, he still made some very explicit decisions, including reducing the severity of the content by removing certain graphic elements. So the second screen I have here is a visualization made while discussing school shootings, and it's made with stick figures and little caution symbols, and there's a bunch of lines all over the screen. Now, this still probably would have been disturbing to some people who were exposed to this type of trauma, but overall, by removing the graphic nature of showing images of the aftermath, it really provided a layer of protection that was important. And that takes us to create barriers to triggers. So I had already talked about, removing autoplay or adding a blur overlay on multimedia. But there's also things like adding opt-out settings, like I talked about on Twitter, the alert before the war in Ukraine, or even just putting potentially triggering content within some form of disclosure. And there's actually a really great example from a group I'm on in Facebook called People's Image Descriptions. And back when the George Floyd protests were happening, there were a lot of requests for image descriptions to understand what was going on, because people weren't including alt text or image descriptions. And there's a screenshot on the page from this group, and it says, "Hi, loves, quick check-in to say images which depict violence towards and the pain of marginalized populations should be nested in a comment with a trigger warning / content warning in the post asking for a description. Let's help marginalized people, specifically people of color, to not have to be re-traumatized by these images." And this was such a simple but powerful way to make sure that these images, which people needed described so they could understand what was going on, weren't randomly showing up on someone's news feed without their ability to control whether it shows up there or not. And then we get to the third point, which is to warn early and often across all zones. And the first thing is to just consider how you warn across the time, the place, and the space as a whole. And one of the really great things that came of me bringing this up with DQ and specifically with Glenda Sims at the talk or after the sessions last year is I actually didn't have any ideas, but they listened to what I'd learned about trigger warnings just in the work I'd been doing elsewhere in various groups. And they thought about all of those zones, even though I hadn't even thought of the idea of zones. So if you go and look at the 2021 session archives and you go to Val Head and Eric Bailey's sessions, the links themselves have content warnings, the page title has a content warning, and the page itself has a very explicit content warning. It is giving people multiple ways to check in and figure out before they get there. It is essentially that A-frame outside of the room. They found a way to provide that. And I think in the future, people will even think of features for people to pre-select or opt out. We are maybe in a really, really large event where there could be lots of triggering content, like maybe a medical conference, and some people don't want graphic imagery. And there could be more specific warnings, and you could even say, nope, don't want any of those sessions. And then you have a nice little agenda that just shows you what you want. And then the fourth point, which probably doesn't need to be said, but still absolutely should be said, we need to ensure the actual accessibility of these warnings. So earlier I had shown a picture of Instagram and this little blur overlay that they have, but it very much was not passing color contrast. So that is not a warning that is accessible to everyone. They're for everyone. So they need to be accessed by everyone. And we absolutely need to account for how disabled users navigate and interact with the web, which in the instance that I was giving from AxCon 2021 sessions, where they added it in the page title and everything else, it accounts for the fact that people are going to be skipping around the page, and it gives them multiple points and opportunities to hear that warning. And finally, decreasing sensory load. First point, captions, captions, captions. Already at AxCon, I have turned off the audio because I have an auditory processing disorder and I just could not process sound anymore appropriately. And the captions were a lifesaver. I think it's also important that we make sure we're providing or otherwise controlling background and external sources of audio. This includes audio within a presentation or audio after, incidental music. Already at AxCon, there was one instance where I don't think the levels were set quite right, and there was really, really loud music at the end. And that's actually what I needed to switch to captions for the next session. And it's also about providing breaks between activities or async options. So recordings are always going to be wonderful for people, especially those who just can't go session to session to session.
Now, this is just the beginning of the journey. As we get further down the road, the landscape will shift. The playbook is going to have to change. And this is okay. Accessibility is a moving target. Just as technology is ever changing, accessibility is carried along with it. In addition, we are learning more about mental health every year, and best practices will evolve as we gain new knowledge about our mind, our body, and our mind body connection. We can't rely on kindness. Accessibility laws and standards exist for a reason. However, with a few exceptions, our current accessibility laws and standards don't directly address trigger warnings. While it could technically fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act and other international and local laws, the burden on proving the need for trigger warnings would be placed on the individual. So we can definitely do better by adding trigger warnings to accessibility standards and creating legislation that enforces these standards. And now, innovation in tech. Features like blur overlays, opt-out settings, and other forms of filtering will be the rule, not the exception. Just as Tori was talking about the blur overlays from Facebook and Instagram, we just have to have that be the rule from now on. But we are actually more interested in what innovations you can bring to the table. This is a wonderful group of people, and we can only imagine what's in store for the future as we prioritize user choice and safety in design as we move forward towards Web 3.0. And that's it for our talk on trigger warnings and content note warnings.
Okay, great. Well, we have some extra time now to jump into some questions. So let me pull that screen up here and see what we've got. Oh, we have quite a bit of activity. So let's see. Out of our questions, let's see which ones. I'm going to give people just a second to upvote the questions that they are fond of, if they agree. And we'll see if any rise to the top here. But I'll go ahead and pick one that we can start on. Where can we learn more or get more information to put in our training materials? So there's not a lot of specificity there, but if you were to start incorporating this, how would you propose doing that where you'd incorporate it into some training materials?
There's a lot of great links in higher education. Tufts University in particular is one that's coming to mind. But yeah, academia has been having to navigate this for much longer. So I'd recommend looking at their guides and finding what works for you in particular. Because if you're not, looking at a classroom setting, then you might need to adapt it for your own event.
Okay, great. All right, we will skip to our next one, which is also relative to training trends. What do you think about the training trends? Oops, sorry, it jumped around here. when people provide music as a background with training slides, decks, or videos?
I have a lot of thoughts on this one. So I'll start by saying that there is an amazing AAA WCAG criterion called low or no background audio. I get really, really distracted by sounds. So I absolutely, if you can just avoid having sounds in the background, I recommend it. But there's actually specific decibel range. There's a decibel range and like a minute and max in that low or no background audio. So if you're looking for something really technical, I would recommend looking that criterion up. But I had no idea that this was a trend. But maybe it's because I keep going to accessibility conferences and people don't do that.
Okay, let's get on to our next one, which is from Glenda, actually. How do you deal with people who respond to this topic like it doesn't exist? I think there's a huge lack of awareness and understanding in the area of cognitive accessibility.
I think you should start with this one.
So this is actually something that I struggle with within my own life. So I think the best thing to tell people who say that, this isn't really that important to think about, is just to kind of bring it back to them. Just say, like, have you ever been listening to a song and someone puts on the TV? Like, does that ever bother you? Like for me, I can't hear two sounds at once in the same room that are very similar in style. So it's either like a TikTok video or if I'm watching something, some of that can be like really, really irritating. And I try to explain it in the sense that, like, has something ever irritated you? Like, what happened to make you irritated? I mean, that's how I've explained it to a lot of my family and friends so I got diagnosed with MS and I've experienced a lot of different symptoms, and trying to explain it in a way that they can relate to themselves, I think, is really helpful in cases like this. So that's probably my best advice for that.
I have something I want to add on to that,
Yeah,
which was huge for me too. So basically, like, major +1 to everything you just said. But I think what really made it work for me is when I was talking to my spouse and I was trying to explain brain fog to him, which, I mean, it doesn't deal with triggers, but it's similar to the whole cognitive accessibility situation. And he's like, well, you're just explaining things that other people have. And I was trying my darndest to get him to understand. And then he mentioned, well, yeah, it happens to me a couple of times a day. And I was like, I'm lucky if it only happens to me 40 times a day. And then, like, his eyes just got really wide and he was like, oh, I get it now. So, there's a lot of things that are a little bit universal, but the difference is what may be an irritant is an actual blocker. It's like a do not pass go. It's like Monopoly, go straight to jail. You get to do nothing the rest of the day. So I think it's getting people to make that leap in faith a little bit. And it does take the person being able to make a leap in faith.
Yeah. It's like garnering that empathy. You have to connect to them in a certain way where, they see the need for themselves as well. As bad as that sounds, sometimes they need that connection there for it to really click fully. Okay, let's get to another one here that's really highly voted. Where do you think the line is between calling out a trigger explicitly, for example, panic attacks, and potentially triggering somebody by naming the topic?
Oh, I mean, like we said before earlier, I believe Tori mentioned that mentioning certain types of triggers can actually cause triggers. So in different cases, I mean, I think it really varies. Yeah.
So
context, maybe.
It's really difficult. And so there's actually certain things where, like, people will literally, like, bleep out the word because there's certain words, like the ones dealing with sexual assault, starting with R, that, like, literally just saying the word or reading the word is too much for people. Mm-hmm. So I'm in some other Facebook groups for people who are, like, chronically ill and have other disabilities. And, there's certain words where people are asked to, like, basically censor the word itself. And there's, like, explicit kind of ways to talk about it, but it is really difficult because, like, on the one hand, you want to be specific enough that someone can choose how to engage with that content or to not engage with the content, but you don't want to be so specific that you cause issues as well. I will say that it's something that seems to be difficult to navigate. The one thing that is nice about this, it's like I'm in, like, a bunch of Star Trek groups. It's, like, specifically a Star Trek group for disabled people because it has to be that niche. But it's just like a bunch of Trekkies talking about all the random stuff that goes wrong, and people will screw up. They won't interpret the instructions well, but there's a grace behind it. And, like, the people who moderate will say, can you please edit this, add in this content warning, trigger warnings, and it's a conversation. I think that's kind of where I'm getting. And the conversation and what's appropriate will also depend on the activity or the space in question and the audience.
Yeah, for me, when in doubt too, like I will usually put something just in case because I just want to be careful and, you know, be empathetic towards what someone else might experience if I don't put things in a right way. So I think that, like Tori was saying, yeah, it's difficult. And sometimes if you don't know exactly what to do, I say to us, err on the side of caution. It's always better than, you know, having someone see your content and get triggered.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that was a great answer. I think that was kind of what I was kind of thinking about too, like how much context is a little bit too much context, like where's the line there? So I think that was a really thorough answer to that. Let's jump to the next one here. Oh, I think I just clicked the wrong one. That's sorry. If you want to, if your question doesn't get answered, you can resubmit it. But the next one down here is, I came across someone in my DE&I organization who questioned using trigger warnings in a mental health discussion. What's the best way to educate about using them?
I'll let you start.
Thanks. So I'm not personally an educator, but if I was doing like trainings with someone, I mean, I think that it should start from the academia level. People should be learning about triggers and content warnings and things like this when we're young. It's really something that I feel like you have to learn at a younger age, and we should be encouraging people to be more aware and do their best, you know, to understand why we should be careful with some of the content we post and why it might be more tactful to not include something so graphic. So I think that it definitely, on an academic level, I think that should be a standard. And in home life, I think it should be a standard. But I feel like, yeah, it's hard when you're talking about mental health because there are so many different facets. I hope that wasn't so weird. Tori, go ahead.
I have a couple of thoughts since I've been sitting with it. So just in general, there's kind of an issue with DEI spaces where they think that access isn't included. So they'll try to like add an A to the end when the A for access is implied in inclusion and equity, and people with disabilities are included in diversity. So one of the things I've done, and this was something I did in partnership with another organization, the way some of the sentences were phrased was problematic, and we kind of appealed to intersectionality and also like, hey, if you said this in a different way and said, well, I don't care about this other thing, how would that make you feel? Like appeal to where they are currently living. And what their particular DEI sensibilities are and why they're there in the first place. And I think that that's, you know, especially appealing to intersectionality is really important. And it's also why, you know, one thing that is very common in disability spaces, especially chronic illness spaces, is that disability is like a white, or chronic illness is like a white woman thing. They are the ones who get all the attention and all the focus. So I'm always like trying to boost other voices because, you know, we're the ones mostly getting medical care. I mean, I still have issues getting medical care, but largely I have a lot less issues than other people who have multiple marginalizations. So I try to boost those voices because those voices can be much louder and much more important.
Yeah, I think that's really true. You know, we do get used to seeing things through our own perspective. So sometimes it can be really useful to kind of get outside of that box that you've set for yourself and kind of try and walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, if that's the phrase you want to go with. But yeah, just having that compassion for the different experience. Let's see. Here's one that is related to automated tests, which is kind of more of a development question, I would say. Are there automated tests for testing video content for animations or vestibular triggers?
Vestibular triggers, no. And I'm really bummed about that. I think it's just like, I think the case with that is that it's so individual, but there is something called PEAT, PEAT. It's like photosensitive epilepsy, something, something. I don't know the last two letters, but basically it's kind of old and it's a little wonky. Like I can never get the upload video aspect to work, but if you do like the screen share, it can actually test for the epilepsy 3 flashes. So it's not automated in the sense that you still have to like run a video through, but whenever I'm worried about like flickering or flashing or whatnot, I use that to kind of prove whether or not something fails that particular criterion.
Okay, yeah, and that's a start. I mean, any tool that you can use is a good start to improving your accessibility. So yeah, I'll have to look that one up. PEAT is what you said?
Yep, PEAT. And like you can even do this thing. So like one for flickering, there's like 2 other scenarios outside of actual flashing where it can come up. Sometimes when people don't manage responsiveness well, you can get like a middle break point where like it like jumps back and forth and it's all over the place. So I'll use it to check for that. And also one thing you can do, although it's not a perfect like test of vestibular disorders, is if there's a lot of parallax and somebody's like moving like really quickly scrolling down a page, you can also test for flashing and flickering that way. Though of course, here's where I will also say, use the style sheet prefers reduced motion and only include essential motions and animations whenever possible.
Agreed. Yeah, that's very important. No, only when you need it. So I think we might have time for one last question. I am going to go with the one at the top here. What are some ways to provide trigger warnings and image descriptions or alt text for those using a screen reader? So when the screen reader comes upon that image, it's automatically going to read out your alt text or image description. What are ways to provide some kind of warning before the user encounters that text? And is that something that that we're working on addressing? Because that's actually a great question I'd never thought about before. There's not really a way to—
I haven't either.
Yeah, just stop that. So that's a great question. I don't have any solutions, but we're always looking for one. If anyone wants to take a shot at it, I would imagine that could be very useful. Is that something that you guys think should be by default, where it kind of inserts those warnings before it starts reading the alt text, or should that be a choice to have those warnings?
So I think this kind of goes back to what the overall user experience is. So ideally, someone is getting, like every user is getting this warning before the image is even exposed on the web page.
Mm-hmm.
So in thinking about what that means for various assistive technology users, it goes a little bit beyond the visual blur overlay to actually like maybe doing like an asset swap or something, or like hiding the actual content. And, you know, as long as that initial warning is there and then someone selects to go in, then we've provided that sufficient choice and opt-in. If that's not an option because the technology doesn't offer it as an option, then I'd say it probably should be at the beginning of the alt text or image description.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for your presentation today and for answering a few questions from our viewers. Just a reminder that you can watch the recording of this. It'll be available on demand after the session ends, and you can check that out on the session page. And if you have any questions, definitely keep submitting them our way, and we will make sure they get to where they need to go. But thanks again for joining, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank
Thank you all.
you.
Bye.